She was eating berries she knew would kill her. Eliza Harrow crouched in the ditch beside the Laramie Road, hand shaking, mouth already bitter with the poison, because starving slow was worse than dying fast. And a man on a horse was about to change everything she thought she'd lost forever. A widow with no home, no money, and no name worth saving. A rancher with a question nobody expected. One answer would decide whether a whole frontier ranch lived or died before the snow came. Stay with me to the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. The berries were called nightshade by some, and worse by others, and Eliza Harrow knew exactly what they'd do to her. She knew because her mother had taught her, back in Ohio, in a kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke and a life that no longer existed. Don't ever touch these, Lizzie, pretty as they are. They'll stop your heart before you finish the bowl. Eliza had been 7 years old. She'd nodded the way children nod, not understanding, only filing the warning away in the place where you keep the things grown-ups say with a certain weight in their voice. 26 years later, on her knees in a dry ditch on the road north out of Laramie, she remembered the warning, and she ate the berries anyway. Not all at once. That was the cowardly part, she thought, the part she'd be ashamed of if there were anyone left to be ashamed in front of. She picked them one at a time off the dusty stems, rolled each one between her fingers, and put it in her mouth slow, like she was deciding. As if there were a choice. As if the choice hadn't been made for her 3 weeks ago, when the bank in Cheyenne handed her a folded paper, and a man with soft hands explained, very gently, that the homestead was no longer hers and never had been, on account of debts she hadn't known her husband signed. The first berry was sour, and then sweet, and then sour again, and it burned a little going down. She sat back on her heels. The afternoon sun came down white and pitiless over the sagebrush, and the wind moved through the grass with a dry hissing sound, and somewhere far off a hawk made one long lonesome cry and then went quiet. Eliza looked at the few coins of light coming through the leaves and thought, absurdly, that it was a pretty day to die on. She'd walked 11 miles since dawn. She'd eaten the last of her bread 2 days ago. A heel of it, hard as a hoof, that she'd softened in creek water and chewed until her jaw ached. Her shoes had come apart at the left toe, and she'd bound them with a strip torn off her petticoat, and the binding had worn through, and now her foot bled into the dust with every step, and she'd stopped noticing. Her body had stopped being a thing she lived inside. It was just a load she was hauling, and she was tired, and the berries were right there, dark and shining and easy. She put a second one in her mouth. That was when she heard the horse. Bus. Caleb Ashcroft hadn't meant to take the Laramie Road that afternoon. He'd meant to be home, getting after the south fence line, which had been down in 3 places since the spring melt and would only get worse. But he'd ridden into town to argue with the man at the feed store about a bill, and he'd lost the argument, and then he'd lost a second argument at the bank. And by the time he turned the buckskin north, he was in the kind of black mood where a man takes the long road just so he doesn't have to talk to anybody. So he was alone, and going slow, and that's why he saw her. A shape down in the ditch where there shouldn't have been a shape. Dark cloth against the pale dirt. He reined up out of habit more than curiosity. A body by the road usually meant something a man would want to ride wide of. And then he saw the shape move, lift a hand to its mouth, and he understood it was a woman, and that she was alive, and that she was doing something with her hand he didn't right away comprehend. "Hey," he said. She didn't look up. Caleb swung down. His boots hit the road and he stood there a second, the reins in his fist, the buckskin blowing and stamping behind him. He was not a man who handled people well. He'd be the first to tell you so. He could gentle a green colt and he could read weather off a cloud, and he could lay a straight line of fence across rough country. But people had always been a foreign language to him, one he'd given up trying to learn somewhere around the time he buried his wife. "Ma'am," he tried again, and walked closer and saw what she had in her hand. He crossed the ditch in 2 strides and knocked it out of her fingers. The berries scattered in the dust. Eliza came up off her heels with a sound that wasn't quite a scream, swinging at him, her open hand catching him across the jaw. Not hard. She didn't have hard left in her, but it surprised him, and he stepped back. "Leave me be," she said. Her voice came out cracked and small. "Leave me be. You've got no right. Lady, those'll kill you. I know what they are." She was breathing fast. Her eyes were enormous in a face gone gray and gaunt, and there was a smear of dark juice at the corner of her mouth, and Caleb felt something turn over in his chest that he didn't have a name for. I know exactly what they are. Now get back on your horse. He didn't. He stood in the ditch with the sun on his neck and looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd look at an animal to judge what was wrong with it. He saw the bound-up foot and the blood. He saw the dress that had once been good and was now ruined, the bones standing out at her wrists, the lips cracked white from thirst. He saw a woman who'd been walking a long time toward nothing. "How many'd you eat?" he said. "That's no business of how many." Something in his voice got through. She blinked. "2," she said. "Maybe 3." Caleb let out a breath. 2 or 3 might be all right. 2 or 3 might just make her sick. He'd seen a steer eat a whole stand of larkspur once and live, and he'd seen a man die from a thing you'd swear couldn't hurt a fly. So he didn't know for certain, but 2 or 3, she had a chance. "You got water?" he asked. "No." He went back across the ditch to the buckskin and pulled the canteen off the saddle and brought it to her and held it out. She looked at it like it might be a trick. "It's water," he said. "Drink it. All of it. We need it to come back up, the berries with it." She took the canteen. Her hands were shaking so bad she could barely get the stopper. And Caleb almost did it for her, but knew better and waited. And finally she got it and drank. She drank like an animal, gulping, water running down her chin and her neck. And when she'd had half of it, he said, slow down, or you'll..." She doubled over and was sick into the ditch. Caleb looked away. "Gave her that much?" The buckskin pulled at a clump of grass and the hawk cried again, way off, and the woman heaved and shuddered and finally went still, on her hands and knees in the dirt, her hair fallen loose around her face. When she could talk, she said very quietly, not looking at him, "I didn't ask you to do that. I know it. You had no right. You said..." She sat back, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. There was a long silence, and into it the woman said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I haven't got anywhere to go. There isn't anything. Do you understand? I sat down here and I thought it through, and there isn't one single thing left to me, and I made up my mind, and you came along, and you interrupted me like I was a child reaching for a hot stove." Her voice broke on the last of it. "And now I have to figure it all out again, so thank you. Thank you very much." Caleb Ashcroft had no idea what to say to that. He had buried a wife. He knew the shape of the thing she was describing, the great flat nothing that comes after a loss too big to carry, and he knew there were no words that touched it because he'd had them all tried on him at the funeral and not one had landed. So he didn't reach for words. He crouched down on his heels a few feet from her, the reins still in his hand, and he looked out at the sagebrush, and he asked her the only question that came to him. "Can you cook?" Eliza turned her head and stared at him. What? She thought she'd misheard. She'd just told this stranger, this big, sun-blasted, hard-faced stranger who'd ruined her death, that she had nothing left in the entire world, and his answer was to ask whether she could cook. It was so absurd that something happened in her chest that might, in a stronger body, have been a laugh. As it was, it just came out as a sort of stunned exhale. "What?" she said. "Can you cook?" He said it again the exact same way, no softer, no harder, looking at her now with those flat gray eyes that didn't seem to want anything from her, which was itself a strange and unfamiliar feeling. Everyone who'd looked at her these last months had wanted something. Money she didn't have, a debt paid, a woman to be moved along out of the way of decent business. This man just seemed to be asking a question. Eliza found her mouth had gone dry again, despite the water. "Yes, I can cook. I can cook well." How well? She didn't know why she answered him. Pride, maybe. The one thing the bank and the road and the hunger hadn't managed to take. "My mother kept a boarding house," she said. 12 men at table, 3 meals a day, every day, from when I was 9 years old till I married at 19. I cooked for threshing crews. I cooked for a logging camp one winter when my husband took work in the pines, 40 men, and not one of them ever pushed back his plate. I can stretch $1 across a week and a chicken across a Sunday, and I can make a tough old hen taste like Christmas if I have to. Her chin came up. "So, yes, mister, I can cook." Caleb nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. He shifted his weight on his heels. "I run a ranch," he said. North of here, up against the Medicine Bow foothills. Cattle. I've got 9 hands and no woman to feed them, and a cook who quit on me 3 weeks ago to go dig gold in the Black Hills, which he won't find, but that's his lookout. Since then, the men have been doing for themselves, and the result is the worst food in the territory and a bunkhouse full of sour tempers, and I've lost 2 good hands over it already, because a man will put up with hard work and bad pay, but he will not put up with bad food forever. He paused. It's not soft work. It's a hot stove in summer and a cold cabin in winter, and a lot of hungry men with opinions. The pay is $20 a month, and you're bored in a room of your own off the kitchen, which is more than I ought to offer, and less than the work's worth. He stood up. His knees cracked. He held out his hand to help her, and then seemed to think better of it, and instead just stood there with his hat throwing a shadow over half his face. I'm Caleb Ashcroft, he said, and I'd be a fool to ride off and leave a cook in a ditch when I need one bad enough to dream about it. So, that's the offer. Eliza looked at his outstretched. No, he'd pulled it back. She looked at the man. She looked at the scattered berries in the dust, the ones she'd been about to use to leave the world, and she thought about how strange it was that the world had decided not to let her go quite yet, and had sent a sour-tempered cattleman with a stove that needed tending to make the argument. She did not trust it. She'd learned hard these last months what trusting got you. A friendly banker was the most dangerous thing in the West. A man with a kind offer in a lonely place was a story that ended badly for women who said yes. Why? She said. Why would you do that? For somebody you found in a ditch? For the first time, the hard face cracked, not into a smile, nothing so generous, but into something rueful and tired and almost human. Because I'm hungry, lady, Caleb Ashcroft said, and because I've sat where you're sitting, near enough, and nobody asked me a fool question that gave me something to do the next morning, so I figure I owe it forward. He turned and walked back toward the buckskin. You can ride or you can stay, but the berries will still kill you tomorrow, if that's what you want, and they cost nothing, so there's no rush on that account. The ranch is a half-day's ride, and the offer's only good while I'm pointed at it. He gathered the reins and put a boot in the stirrup. Eliza Harrow sat in the ditch a moment longer. The sun had begun its slide toward the western ridges, and the light had gone gold and long, and her foot throbbed, and her stomach was empty and aching, and somehow, impossibly, interested. The first interest it had shown in anything in days. A stove. 9 men. A kitchen. A reason to find out what the next morning looked like. She got up. It took her 3 tries, and Caleb Ashcroft watched her do it without offering to help, and she understood somehow that this was a kindness, too, that the help would have shamed her, and he knew it. I won't be any man's anything but his cook, she said. I'll have that understood before I get on that horse. Understood, Caleb said. Wouldn't have it any other way. I've got enough trouble. And I'll have a lock on my door. There's one already. The last cook was a nervous fella. Eliza walked toward the horse on her ruined feet. And if the food's good, you'll say so. I've cooked for men who treated a good meal like the weather, like it just happened, like nobody made it. I won't work for a man like that. If it's good, you'll say so, and if it's bad, you'll tell me how, and we'll get on. Caleb looked down at her from the saddle, this woman who'd been eating poison 10 minutes ago and was now negotiating terms, and something in his chest turned over again, that nameless thing. If it's good, he said, I'll say so. You have my word for whatever a stranger's word is worth to you, which I figure isn't much today. It isn't, Eliza agreed. Fair enough. He took his boot out of the stirrup and reached down. Come on. You ride, I'll walk a stretch and stretch my legs. You're lighter than you ought to be, and the buckskin won't notice you. This time she took his hand. The ranch sat in a long, shallow valley where the foothills began to fold up toward the mountains, and Eliza saw it first as the sun was going down, a scatter of weathered buildings around a creek, the cattle dark specks on the far slopes, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney and a thin gray thread that meant somebody was burning supper. That'll be Dutch, Caleb said, walking at the buckskin's head. He'd walked most of the last 2 hours, talking little, and Eliza had ridden in a kind of swaying half-dream, exhausted past the point of fear, her hands knotted in the buckskin's mane. Dutch is the wrangler. He's been doing the cooking since Tom left, on account of he claimed he could, and he can't, and now nobody will let him forget it. You'll smell it before we get there. She did. Burnt beans and scorched coffee, and under it something worse. Something that might have been meat once. Her empty stomach clenched, but not in hunger. In a kind of professional offense, an instinct older than thought. Whoever this Dutch was, he'd let the fire get away from him, and he hadn't soaked the beans, and he was burning good coffee because he couldn't be bothered to watch the pot. The buildings resolved as they came down the valley. A long, low bunkhouse, a barn with a sagging roofline, corrals, a smithy, a tack shed, a ranch house bigger than the rest with a deep porch and dark windows, and the cookhouse, separate, squat, its single window glowing orange, the door propped open with a rock to let out smoke. Men began to drift out of the bunkhouse as they heard the horse. They came in twos and threes, the way working men do at the end of a day, stiff and slow and watchful, and they stood in the dust and watched Caleb Ashcroft bring home a strange woman on his horse, and nobody said a word, and the silence had a weight to it that made Eliza sit up straighter despite her exhaustion. Caleb stopped the buckskin in the middle of the yard. "This is Mrs. Harrow," he said to all of them, in a voice that did not invite discussion. "She's our new cook. She starts in the morning. You'll treat her like you'd treat your own mother if your mother could break you in half, which most of yours could, having met them." A couple of the men's mouths twitched. "Dutch, you're relieved. God knows the men'll thank you." "I said God doesn't enter into it," somebody muttered, and there was a low ripple of something that wasn't quite laughter. A short, bow-legged man with an enormous mustache stepped forward, Dutch, plainly, by the way he looked both relieved and wounded. "I'd like the record to show," he said, with great dignity, "that I never claimed to be no cook. I claimed I could make food, which I done. There's a difference, and I'll thank you all to remember it when you're praising this lady. Dutch, your beans give Pete the green apple two-step for 3 days running." "That weren't the beans. It was the beans, Dutch." This time it was laughter, real laughter, the tired, good-natured laughter of men glad of any small break in a hard day, and under cover of it Caleb helped Eliza down off the horse. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and his hand closed hard around her arm and held her up, and for just a second she was leaning her whole inconsequential weight against this stranger, and then she got her feet under her and stepped back, and he let go. "You'll eat," Caleb said to her, quiet now, just for her. "Then you'll sleep. The cooking starts tomorrow, not tonight. Tonight you're a guest and you don't do a thing but get yourself back into the land of the living. Dutch, what is there that's edible?" Dutch looked pained. "There's bread," he said. "The bread come out all right, and there's the ham what I didn't get to yet." "Bread and ham, then. Mrs. Harrow." Caleb gestured toward the cookhouse. "After you." The cookhouse, when she stepped into it, was a disgrace. Eliza stood in the doorway and took it in by the light of a single guttering lamp, and a fire that had been let to roar when it should have been banked, and a kind of cold fury settled over her, pushing back the exhaustion. The big iron range was crusted black with spilled grease that had been burning on for days. The work table was a chaos of dirty pots and a sack of flour left open to the mice and a slab of bacon going soft in the heat with no cloth over it. The floor was sticky. There were dishes, she counted without meaning to. There were dishes for a dozen men piled in a wreck by the dry sink, crusted hard, drawing flies even in the cool of evening. "I know," Caleb said behind her. "I know. Tom kept it better. It's gotten away from us." Eliza didn't answer. She walked into the room, past the wreckage, to the range, and she crouched down, her bad foot complaining. And she opened the firebox and looked at the bed of coals raging away in there, eating up wood that somebody had cut and split, wasting it. And she reached for the damper without thinking and adjusted it down, and the roar settled to a mutter. "That's better," she said, mostly to herself. "You're burning a quart a day in this thing the way it's set." Behind her, Caleb said nothing. When she stood and turned, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Sit down," she told him. "Where's the bread?" "I'll get Dutch to—" "You'll sit down. I can find a loaf of bread in a kitchen, mister, even one as far gone as this one." She was already moving, already finding the bread box, already finding it half empty with a good brown loaf inside that was, she pressed it, a day old but sound. She found a knife. She found, after some looking, a board that was clean enough, and she wiped it anyway with a corner of her ruined skirt because there wasn't a clean cloth in the place. She found the ham. She cut bread and she cut ham, And she did it fast and even, the long muscle memory of 10,000 suppers taking over. And Caleb Ashcroft sat down on the bench at the long table and watched her work. And for the first time all day, the lines around his eyes eased a little. She put the plate down in front of him. "What's this?" he said. "It's your supper. You walked half the day leading that horse so I could ride. You think I didn't notice?" She sat down across from him with a smaller portion for herself, because she knew better than to eat much on an empty stomach, knew it would make her sick, and she made herself go slow, one small bite, chew, wait. "Eat your supper, Mr. Ashcroft." He ate. So did she. Outside the door, the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the valley had gone blue and then dark. And a chill came in off the mountains the way it does even in summer at that altitude, and the fire muttered in the range, and the two of them sat at the long scarred table and ate bread and ham in a silence that was, against all odds, not uncomfortable. When he'd finished, he sat back and looked at her. "You set that fire right in about 4 seconds, he said. "Took me a month to learn that damper, and I still don't trust it. My mother would have boxed my ears if I'd let a range run wild like that." Eliza looked at the firebox. "Half the work of cooking is the fire. Men never understand that. They think it's the food. It's the fire. Get the fire right, and the food half cooks itself. Get it wrong, and you can't save anything." Caleb was quiet a moment, then, "What happened to you, Mrs. Harrow?" She looked up sharp. "You don't have to say," he added. I'm not asking to pry. A woman like you doesn't end up where I found you for no reason. And if there's a man coming after you, or a debt, or trouble that's going to ride up my road some morning, I'd rather know it now." She considered him across the table. The lamp flame stood up straight and threw both their shadows huge against the dirty walls. She found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to tell him, or not wanted exactly, but felt the words pressing, the way a wound presses when it's been closed too long over something that should have come out. "My husband died," she said. "Joseph, in the spring. We had a homestead down past Cheyenne, good land. We'd worked it 4 years and we were near to proving up, near to owning it free and clear." She turned the heel of bread over in her fingers. "He took a chill in the wet and it went to his lungs, and in 9 days he was dead. And I buried him myself because the nearest neighbor was 6 miles off and his wife was about to be confined and he couldn't leave her. I dug the grave myself. It took 2 days. The ground was still half frozen." "I'm sorry," Caleb said. He said it plain, no flourish, and she believed him. "Then the bank came." Her voice went flat and hard. "Turned out Joseph had borrowed against the land, to buy seed and a team, and then to buy more seed when the first crop failed. And he never told me, because he was a proud man and he was sure he'd have it paid before it mattered. And then he was dead and it mattered very much. The note came due and I couldn't pay it, and the bank took the homestead. Everything, the house, the team, the few head we had, the furniture. They sold my mother's table out from under me to a man in town. And there was a paper that said it was all legal, all proper, and a man with soft white hands explained to me very kindly that I should have read what I signed." She set the bread down. "I never signed anything, but it didn't matter. The paper said I had, and who's going to take a widow's word over a bank's?" The cookhouse was very quiet. "So I walked," Eliza said. "I had a sister in Montana, or I thought I did. Turned out she'd moved on and nobody knew where. So that was a road that ended in a strange town with nothing at the end of it. And I walked some more. And I sold what I had, which wasn't much, and I ate what I could, which got to be less and less. And then I was on the Laramie Road eating poison, and then you came along and asked me a fool question." She looked up at him. "That's the whole of it, Mr. Ashcroft. There's no man coming after me. There's no trouble going to ride up your road. There's just me, and I'm a good cook, and I'd be obliged for the work, and I'm too tired to lie to you about any of it tonight. So you've got the truth, all of it, for free." Caleb Ashcroft looked at her across the table for a long moment. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said finally. "Sarah. Fever, the same one that took half the valley that winter. We didn't have children. We'd wanted them. It hadn't come, and then it never would." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "After she went, I didn't know what to do with myself, so I worked. That's all I've done for 4 years, Mrs. Harrow. I've worked this ranch like a man trying to outrun something, and I've watched it slide anyhow, because a ranch is too big for one man's grief to hold up, and I've got debts of my own coming due, and a hard winter could finish me. And most nights I can't see how it doesn't. He set the cup down. So when you say there's nothing left, and you don't see how the next morning looks, I'm not just being neighborly when I say I've sat where you're sitting. I sit there most nights. I just haven't found my poison berry bush yet. It was, Eliza would think later, the strangest first conversation she'd ever had with anyone. Two ruined people in a filthy kitchen, trading their worst losses across a scarred table by lamplight, not for comfort, because there wasn't any, but just to set the truth down on the wood between them and look at it. Well, she said at last, I can't fix your debts, but I can fix this kitchen, and I can put food in 9 men that'll make them work harder and stay longer and stop quitting on you, and that's not nothing, Mr. Ashcroft. That's not nothing at all. Something moved behind his eyes. Not hope, exactly. He didn't look like a man who let himself have hope, but something close to it, something that had been a long time dark and was now considering the possibility of light. No, he said. I don't suppose it is. Well, he showed her the room off the kitchen. Small, plain, a rope bed with a corn-husk tick and a single window, and, true to his word, a lock on the inside of the door. And he set a lamp on the sill and stood awkwardly in the doorway a moment. There's water in the barrel by the door, he said. I'll have Dutch bring you up some hot in the morning so you can wash proper. And I'll have him find you a pair of his wife's old boots. Dutch had a wife. She passed. He keeps her things. I don't ask why. They'll be too big, but they're better than what you've got, till we can get to town. He looked at her bound, bloody foot and looked away. There's salve in the cabinet for that. The men use it on the horses, but it'll do for a person. Thank you, Eliza said. Don't thank me till you've cooked on that range a week and decided whether you forgive me for the ditch. He put his hat on. Breakfast is at 5. The men'll be at that table at 5 sharp whether there's food or not, and if there isn't, they'll let you know about it. I'd say I'm sorry for that, but you'd see through it. They're good men mostly, hungry and rough, and they'll test you, and you'll have to give it back to them. But they're good men, and once you've fed them right, they'll walk through fire for you. I've seen it happen. Tom had them eating out of his hand inside a month. 5 o'clock, Eliza said. I'll be ready. He nodded and turned to go, and then stopped, half in the dark of the kitchen. Mrs. Harrow. Mr. Ashcroft. I'm glad I took the long road today, he said. And then, before she could answer, he was gone, his boots loud on the kitchen floor, and then quiet in the yard, and she heard the buckskin nicker as he led it away to the barn. Eliza shut the door. She turned the lock. She sat down on the edge of the rope bed in the small plain room, in the lamplight, and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had thought she would, the way the day had gone, but the tears didn't come. She was past them, dried out, scoured clean. Instead, she sat very still and let the strangeness of being alive wash over her. This morning, she'd been a dead woman walking. Tonight, she had a room with a lock and a job at 5 o'clock, and a bed she didn't have to share with the road. It made no sense. It was too much and too sudden, and she didn't trust a foot of it. And yet, there was a kitchen out there. A disgraceful, filthy, run-into-the-ground kitchen with a good range under the grime and a sound chimney and a sack of flour she could save if she covered it tonight before the mice finished it. There was bread to make before 5 and beans to soak right now, this minute, if she meant to do them properly, and coffee to grind, and that range to scrub down to the iron, and Eliza Harrow lowered her hands. She looked at the door. She'd told the man she was too tired to do anything tonight. She'd meant it. Every bone in her body was meant for sleep. But there was a sack of flour out there about to be lost, and there were beans that needed 8 hours soaking if they were going to be fit to eat at noon. And she looked at the dark window. She had maybe 6 hours till 5 o'clock. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said out loud to the empty room, and she got up. She found, in the cabinet, the horse salve, and she unwound the filthy binding from her foot and washed the cut clean with water from the barrel, gritting her teeth, and she smeared the salve on thick and bound it again with a strip torn off the cleanest thing she owned, and she put on, gingerly, the dead woman's boots that Dutch had left outside her door without a word. Too big, just as Caleb had said, but they held her foot like cupped hands and didn't rub the wound. And then Eliza Harrow walked back out into the ruined kitchen. She built the fire up, properly this time, the damper set right, a clean hot flame and not a wasteful roar. She put water on to heat. She found the bean crock under a mountain of dirty pots, and she scrubbed it and filled it and picked over the beans by lamplight, throwing out the stones and the bad ones, and she set them to soak. She covered the flour, she covered the bacon. She found a rag that would do, and she started in on the range itself, scrubbing the burnt grease off the iron, working by feel and by lamplight, her bad foot up on the rung of a stool to keep the weight off it. And she worked. She didn't think about the bank. She didn't think about Joseph in the half-frozen ground, or the homestead, or the long empty road, or the dark berries shining on the stem. There wasn't room. There was only the work, the next pot, the next handful of beans, the next square inch of iron coming clean under her rag, and the work filled her up the way it always had, the way it had since she was 9 years old in her mother's kitchen, the only medicine she'd ever fully trusted. Around 2 in the morning, she sat down on the stool to rest her foot, just for a minute, and she looked at what she'd done. The range gleamed dully in the lamplight, black iron instead of black grease. The work table was clear and wiped. The beans soaked in their crock. The flour was safe. It was a long way yet from clean, a long way from the kitchen she'd make of this place, given time. But it was a kitchen now, a place where a person could cook, and she'd made it so with her own 2 hands in the middle of the night on the same day she'd meant to die. The strangeness of that caught up to her all at once, and she let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and was, in the end, neither, just the sound of a person who's come a very long way in a single day and isn't sure yet whether she's glad of it. 5 o'clock, she said to the dark kitchen. We'll see what you're made of, Mr. Ashcroft's men. We'll just see. She didn't mean to fall asleep on the stool, but she did, her head down on her folded arms on the clean work table, and she woke with a start to a gray square of window and the sound of boots in the yard and men's voices, low and grumbling, and the realization, cold in her stomach, that it was nearly 5 and she had cleaned the kitchen, but she had not actually made anything. There was no breakfast. There were 9 hungry men about to come through that door, and there was nothing on the range but a crock of beans that wouldn't be ready till noon. For 1 second, Eliza Harrow knew pure panic. Then the 10,000 suppers took over. She was up off the stool before she'd finished thinking, and her hands were moving, flour into the big bowl, the good clean flour she'd saved, and the salt. And she had a fire already laid in the range from the night before, and she pulled the damper and blew the coals to life, and fed them kindling, fast, and the flame caught. Biscuits. You could make biscuits faster than a man could pull his boots on if you knew how, and Eliza knew how, had known how since she was tall enough to reach the table. Lard from the can. She'd found it last night, a good clean can of lard, She'd found it, cut into the flour fast with 2 knives. The buttermilk was a problem, there wasn't any, but there was sour milk in the crock that Dutch had let go, and that was even better for biscuits. And she poured it in and worked it quick, and turned the dough out onto the floured table and patted it and cut it with the mouth of a tin cup because she couldn't find a biscuit cutter. And she had a pan of biscuits in the oven before the first man's hand touched the door. She had bacon in the big skillet, a whole side of it sliced thick and laid down to fry, the smell of it filling the kitchen and rolling out the open door into the gray dawn yard. She had the big coffee pot on, the good coffee she'd ground last night, and she had a second skillet going with the grease from the bacon, and she was cracking eggs into it. There were eggs, a basket of them. The hens were laying, and nobody had been using them. She was cracking eggs 2 at a time, 1 in each hand, the way her mother had taught her, when the cookhouse door swung open and the first ranch hand stuck his head in. He was a young one, raw-boned, with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down, and he opened his mouth to say something, probably something rough, a test, the way Caleb had warned her. And then he smelled the bacon and the coffee and the biscuits browning in the oven, and whatever he'd meant to say died on his lips, and his face did something complicated. Well, he managed. Hell. Sit down, Eliza said, not turning from the stove. It's not ready. 5 more minutes. Sit down and pour yourselves coffee. The pot's on the table. And mind you don't track mud on my clean floor I scrubbed at midnight, or I'll feed you last. The young hand looked at the floor. He looked at his muddy boots. He looked back at the woman at the stove with her bound foot and her ruined dress, and her hands flying over 2 skillets and a pan of biscuits. This stranger who'd ridden in last night more dead than alive, and had somehow, between then and now, turned the worst kitchen in the territory into a place that smelled like a man's own mother's house on a Sunday morning. He sat down. He took his boots off first, at the door, and set them outside, and a couple of the other men coming in behind him saw him do it and after a beat did the same, grumbling. And the grumbling had a different quality to it than it had had in the yard. A grudging, surprised, hopeful quality. The sound of hard men deciding to give something a chance. By the time Caleb Ashcroft came through the door, last of all, ducking his head under the low frame, his 9 hands were sitting at the long table in their socks, with cups of good hot coffee in their fists, quiet as church, watching the woman at the stove, and the whole cookhouse smelled like salvation. And Eliza Harrow turned around with a platter of biscuits in one hand and a skillet of eggs in the other and looked at him across the room. She didn't smile. She was too tired to smile, and besides, she didn't yet know whether she trusted any of this man, or this ranch, or this strange reprieve from a death she'd been ready for. But she lifted her chin, the way she had in the ditch, the one thing nobody had managed to take from her. "You said if it was good, you'd say so," she said. Caleb Ashcroft looked at his men in their socks. He looked at the gleaming range and the clean floor and the platter of biscuits steaming in the gray light. He looked at the woman. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, and took off his hat. "It hasn't smelled like this in here since my wife was alive. Sit down, boys. Eat your breakfast." He pulled out the bench at the head of the table. "And the first man who doesn't thank her can saddle up and ride for the Black Hills with Tom, because I won't have him." Nobody rode for the Black Hills. They ate. They ate like men who'd been starved, which they had, and they ate in a stunned, reverent quiet that broke, finally, into talk, and then into laughter, and then into the young, raw-boned hand standing up at the end of his second helping and saying, "Ma'am, I'd marry you, except I expect you've got better sense," and the whole table roaring, and Eliza Harrow standing at her clean stove in a dead woman's boots, feeding the men of Ashcroft Ranch, alive in spite of everything, with the gray Wyoming dawn coming up gold over the mountains outside the open door. She still didn't trust it. Not yet. But she'd cook them breakfast, and then she'd cook them dinner, and then she'd cook them supper, and she'd see what the next morning looked like. And the morning after that. The morning that broke gold over the mountains turned into a week, and the week turned into a habit, and the habit, without anyone quite deciding it should, turned into the thing the whole ranch was built around. It started with the floor. The men kept taking their boots off at the door the way the young one, his name was Pete, Eliza learned, the raw-boned one with the cowlick, had done that first morning, and she never once asked them to, which was exactly why they kept doing it. A thing a man chooses is a thing a man keeps. Within a fortnight, there was a row of muddy boots lined up under the eave outside the cookhouse every meal, 9 pairs of them in their socks at her table, and the floor stayed clean enough that she stopped having to scrub it on her knees at midnight, and she got, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something close to a full night's sleep. The food changed everything else. She didn't do anything fancy. She'd have told anyone who asked that fancy was the enemy of feeding working men. That what a man wanted at the end of 14 hours in the saddle was not a thing he couldn't pronounce, but a thing he recognized, made right. So she made it right. The biscuits came out of that oven every morning light and high, and there was always gravy, and the bacon was crisp and not burnt, and the coffee was strong without being bitter because she watched the pot. She soaked the beans the night before, every night, and she cooked them slow with a hunk of salt pork and an onion, and they came to the table soft and whole instead of the scorched gravel Dutch had been serving. She found, behind the smokehouse, a kitchen garden gone to weeds that Caleb's wife had planted, and nobody had touched in 4 years. And she got Pete to help her clear it one Sunday, and there were still potatoes down in the ground gone wild and small but good, and a stand of horseradish, and rhubarb coming up through the ruin of it, and Eliza looked at that garden and saw 100 suppers in it and got to work. "You don't have to do all this," Caleb told her one evening, standing in the cookhouse door the way he'd taken to doing, watching her bank the fire for the night. It had become a kind of unspoken arrangement between them, this last quarter hour of the day. He'd come in after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and he'd lean in the doorframe with his hat in his hand, and they'd talk, or not talk, while she finished closing the kitchen down. "Garden's extra. I'm paying you to cook, not to farm. You're paying me $20 a month to keep 9 men working a ranch that's 2 bad weeks from going under," Eliza said, not looking up from the coals. "If I can grow a row of potatoes, that means you don't have to buy them in town. I've earned my keep before I've fried an egg. Besides," she straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back. "It was Sarah's garden. Somebody ought to use it, It seemed a shame, all that work she put in, gone to weeds because nobody could stand to look at it. She'd meant it kindly, but she watched it land on him hard, the way the dead woman's name always did, and she wished for a second she'd held her tongue. But Caleb only stood there a moment, turning his hat, and then he said quietly, "She'd have liked you, Sarah. She had no use for people who fussed. You don't fuss." And he put his hat on and went out into the dark. And Eliza stood alone in the clean kitchen with the strange, warm ache of having been, somehow, paid a compliment by a dead woman she'd never met. She earned the men one at a time, and not with sweetness, because she didn't have much sweetness in her, and they'd have seen through it if she'd tried. She earned them with skill and with a tongue as sharp as theirs when they tested her, which they did, the way men do, to find the edges of a new person and see where she'd hold. There was a big surly hand named Boone, who'd come in the second week and pushed his plate back half-eaten, and said loud enough for the table, "I've ate better in a jailhouse," and the cookhouse had gone quiet, everybody watching to see what the new cook would do. Eliza had come around the table, wiped her hands on her apron, picked up his plate, looked at it, and looked at him. "You've it better in a jailhouse," she repeated. "That's what I said." "Then I expect you committed whatever crime got you there on purpose, for the cooking, and you're missing it." She set the plate back down in front of him with a clack. "There's the door, Mr. Boone, and the road to the nearest jail is south and well marked. But you eat slow getting there, because once you've gone, I'm not making the trip after you when you change your mind, and you will change your mind, because that's the best plate of food that's been in front of you in a year, and you know it, and the only reason you pushed it back is you wanted to see if you could make me cry." She picked up the coffee pot and filled his cup without being asked. "I don't cry, Mr. Boone. I dug my own husband's grave with a frozen spade. You're going to have to do considerably better than insulting my pork to get a tear out of me. Now eat your supper before it's cold, you've got fence to mend in the morning, and you can't do it hungry." There was a silence about a second and a half long, and then the whole table came apart laughing, Boone loudest of all, and he ate every bite on the plate, and two more besides, and from that day forward Boone would have walked off a cliff if she told him the view was worth it. That was how it went. She didn't win them by being soft. She won them by being exactly as hard as they were and feeding them better than their mothers had. And there's no loyalty in the world like the loyalty of a rough man who's been fed and not coddled. By the end of the first month, the bunkhouse had stopped being a place of sour tempers and started being something else. The men lingered at the table after supper instead of scattering. They talked. Somebody dug out a fiddle that had been sitting in a trunk since before the bad winter, and on Saturday nights now there was music in the cookhouse, and Eliza would let them stay as long as they cleaned up after. And she'd sit in the corner mending the endless tears in 9 men's shirts, because their mending had been going undone for a year, and it offended her, and she'd listen to the fiddle and the talk and feel, in spite of herself. In spite of every hard lesson the road had taught her about trusting good things, the first faint warmth of something that might have been belonging. Caleb saw it before she did. He saw the whole ranch lift, the way a team lifts when you finally get the load balanced, and he knew it was her, and it unsettled him because he'd brought her home as a cook, and she was turning into something he didn't have a word for and didn't know what to do with. The day it came clear to him was the day Pete went off the windmill. It was September by then, the cottonwoods down by the creek going yellow, and the windmill that pumped water to the upper corral had thrown a vein, and Pete had climbed up to fix it, because Pete was young and would climb anything, and a rung gave under his boot, and he came down 20 feet onto the hard ground, and the sound of it carried all the way to the cookhouse where Eliza was kneading bread. She knew the sound before she knew what it was. It was the sound of a body hitting earth, and she'd heard it once before, when Joseph fainted from the fever and went down the porch steps, and her hands were out of the dough, and she was running across the yard with flour to her elbows before she'd decided to move. The men had gathered around Pete in a useless knot, the way men do, and somebody was saying, "Don't move him," and somebody else was saying, "We gotta move him," and Pete was white as paper and gray around the mouth, and making a sound, a low, awful sound through his teeth, and his right arm was wrong. That was the thing Eliza saw, pushing through the men, dropping to her knees beside him. His shoulder was wrong. The whole shape of it was wrong, the arm hanging at an angle no arm should hang, the head of the bone shoved up and forward out of where it belonged so that it made a hard lump under the skin near his collarbone. "Out of his shoulder," she said. "It's come out of the socket." "His arm's broke," Boone said. "It's not broke, it's out of the socket. That's different. That's worse, and it's better both at once. Pete." She put her hand on the boy's white face. Pete, look at me. Look at me, not at it. Where's it hurt? Everywhere, Pete got out. Lady, it hurts. I know it, I know. You're going to be all right, but I have to tell you the truth. It's going to hurt worse before it's better, and there's no way around that, so I'm not going to lie to you about it. Where's the nearest doctor? This last to the men, sharp. Laramie, Caleb said. He'd come up behind her. His voice was tight. Half a day there, half back, if Doc Hennessy's even sober and home, which he's about half the time. A day. Eliza looked at the shoulder. She knew what a day meant. A day meant the muscles around that joint would clamp down tighter and tighter, locking the bone where it had no business being, and the longer it stayed out, the more damage it did to everything around it. And by the time a half-drunk doctor got here from Laramie, the boy might have an arm that never worked right again, if he kept the arm at all. She'd seen a man lose an arm to less. She'd seen her own father put a shoulder back once, on a hired hand, in her mother's kitchen, and she'd watched him do it, and she remembered how, or thought she did. And the difference between thinking she remembered and being sure was the difference that could cripple this boy for life. Mrs. Harrow, Caleb said, low, just for her. He'd read her face. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, it has to go back in, soon. Every hour it's out is an hour of damage, and a day is too long, Caleb. She didn't notice she'd used his given name. Neither, quite, did he, until later. I've seen it done. My father did it. I think I can do it. You think? I think? She looked up at him. That's all I've got. I think I can. And if I'm wrong, it'll hurt him worse than it already does and accomplish nothing. And if I'm right, he keeps the use of his arm. And if we wait for Laramie, I don't think he keeps it. That's the choice. It's an ugly one, and it's yours to make. It's your ranch and your man, but you have to make it now because the clock's running. It was, Caleb would think later, the hardest minute of his life up to that point. Harder than the bank, harder in some ways than burying Sarah, because Sarah he couldn't have saved. And Pete he maybe could, by gambling the boy's good arm on the memory of a thing a dead man had done in a kitchen 20 years ago. He looked at Pete, gray and shaking on the ground. He looked at Eliza, flower to her elbows, steady, terrified, hiding the terror because the boy needed her not to be afraid. He thought about how he'd come to trust her. In a month. More than he trusted men he'd known for years. And he didn't know if that trust was wisdom or just the loneliness of a widower latching onto the first warmth that came his way. And he had to decide which it was right now, with a boy's arm in the balance. Do it, he said. What followed was bad, and Eliza never afterward pretended otherwise. She had them carry Pete into the cookhouse and lay him on the long table, the cleanest, flattest surface on the ranch. And she had Boone and Caleb hold him, one at the chest, one bracing the body, and she gave Pete a folded leather glove to bite on because there was nothing else, and the boy was past the point where whiskey would have helped, even if she'd wanted to wait for it to work. She took his wrist and his elbow in her two hands, and she felt for the angle, the way her father had. Easy, no jerking, slow, steady traction, pulling the arm long and out and then around. And Pete screamed into the glove and bucked against the men holding him, and sweat ran down her own face into her eyes, and her hands were slick with it. And for a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The bone wouldn't go. It caught and held, and Pete screamed, and she thought, cold and clear, I've ruined him. I was wrong. I've crippled this child. And then it slipped. She felt it more than heard it, a deep, dull clunk that traveled up through her own arms, the head of the bone sliding back over the lip of the socket and dropping home where it belonged. And Pete's scream cut off all at once into a great shuddering gasp, and the gray went out of his face, and he lay there on the table panting and crying and whole. It's in, Eliza said. Her own voice came out strange. It's back in. Pete, the worst is over. I swear it to you. The worst is done. Pete spat out the glove. He turned his head and looked at his own shoulder, which had a shape again. The right shape, the lump gone, the arm lying natural against his side, and he started laughing, a wet, hiccuping, exhausted laugh. And he said, It still hurts, but it don't hurt like that no more. It'll be sore a good while. Weeks. You'll wear it in a sling, and you'll do no climbing and no roping till I say, and if you take that sling off before I tell you, I'll put something in your beans you won't enjoy. You understand me? But she was crying too now, a little. the fear coming out the back end of it the way it does once the danger's past, and she wiped her face with her flour-dusted wrist and left a white streak down her cheek and didn't care. She bound the arm to his body and made the sling and got 2 cups of strong, sweet coffee into him, and then, when his color was back and his breathing was even, she finally let herself sit down on the bench, all at once, like her strings had been cut. And that was when she realized her own hands were shaking so hard she couldn't have held a cup if her life hung on it. Caleb sat down next to her. The men had carried Pete off to the bunkhouse to rest, and the cookhouse was empty but for the 2 of them and the abandoned bread dough drying out in its bowl, and for a while neither of them said anything. "You were scared," Caleb said finally. "I was terrified." "You didn't show it. The boy never knew." "That's the job," Eliza said. "Whatever you're feeling, the man on the table can't see it, or he panics, and a panicked man fights you, and then you really do hurt him. My father taught me that. You hold your face still, and you keep your hands gentle, and you let yourself shake later, in private, when it's done." She looked down at her shaking hands. "I'm shaking now, so I expect this is the later." Caleb did a thing he had never done. He reached over and put his big hand over both of hers where they trembled in her lap, and he held them still. And he didn't say anything, and Eliza didn't pull away, and the 2 of them sat there at the long table in the empty cookhouse while the light went long and gold through the window, his hand over hers. Both of them not looking at it, not naming it, just letting it be what it was for as long as it lasted. Which wasn't long, a minute, maybe 2, before she gently slid her hands free and stood up and said, the bread was ruined and she'd have to start fresh, and the men would want supper regardless of how the day had gone. But it had happened. They both knew it had happened. The story of it got around. That was the thing about a valley like that one. It was empty as the moon. You could ride a day without seeing a soul, and yet somehow everything anybody did was known to everyone inside a week, carried on the wind or in the saddlebags of men passing through. The story of the cook at Ashcroft's who'd put a hand's shoulder back in on the kitchen table and saved his arm traveled the way good stories travel, getting bigger as it went, so that by the time it came back around to Eliza's own ears, months later from a peddler passing through, she'd apparently set a compound fracture and delivered a breech calf, and talked a man out of dying of pneumonia by sheer force of will, none of which she'd done, but she'd stopped trying to correct it because there was no catching a story once it had the bit in its teeth. What was true was that people started coming. Not many, not at first. A homesteader's wife from down the valley who'd heard the cook at Ashcroft's knew things, come to ask about her own child's croup. A cowhand from the 3 Bar with a cut gone bad that the men there had been ignoring till it nearly took his hand, and Eliza cleaned it and packed it with a poultice, and it healed. She wasn't a doctor, and she said so to everyone, flat, every time. I'm a cook, and I know what my mother knew and my father knew, and that's all. You want a doctor, you go to Laramie. But Laramie was far and Doc Hennessy was drunk, and a woman who dug her own husband's grave and put a boy's shoulder back without flinching was right here, and people came. Caleb watched it happen and felt 2 things at war in him. He felt proud, in a way that surprised him, proud the way you're proud of something that belongs to you, and at the same time uneasy at being proud of a person who didn't belong to him at all, who was a free woman drawing $20 a month and could ride off any morning she chose. And he felt the other thing, the thing he wouldn't look at straight, the thing that had started in a ditch on the Laramie Road when she'd swung at him with the last strength in her body and told him to leave her be, and had grown every day since, quietly, the way the most dangerous things grow. She's not just the cook anymore, he said to Dutch one evening, the 2 of them mending tack in the barn. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. It just came out. Dutch didn't look up from the bridle he was working. No, he agreed. She ain't. Then what is she? Dutch thought about it, working the leather. He'd had a wife once and lost her, and he was the only man on the place who'd loved a woman the way Caleb was starting to understand he might, given half a chance and enough nerve, come to love this one. And so Dutch chose his words with the care of a man who knows the territory. She's the thing that's holding it together, Dutch said finally. The ranch, the men. You, if you want the truth of it, boss. And I figure you don't, but I'll say it anyhow because somebody ought to. A month back, you was a man working himself to death on a place that was sinking, and you knew it was sinking, and you didn't much care because what was there to care about? Now look at you. You're up at the windmill at dawn whistling, which I ain't heard you do since before Miss Sarah passed. You think that's the biscuits?" Dutch shook his head. "It ain't the biscuits, Caleb. It's never been the biscuits." Caleb didn't answer that. He looked out the barn door at the cookhouse across the yard, where smoke rose from the chimney in a clean, straight line and lamplight glowed warm in the window. And he thought about a hand held still over two shaking hands at a long table. And he didn't say anything at all. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, that warm gold September, with the ranch finally finding its feet, and the men finally fed, and the cook who wasn't just a cook anymore quietly becoming the heart that the whole place beat around, was that down in Laramie, in the back office of the bank, a man with soft white hands and a ledger full of other people's ruin had just run his finger down a column of figures and stopped and underlined a name. Ashcroft. The note that Caleb had borrowed against 2 winters back to buy the cattle that were supposed to save the ranch, but it was coming due. And the man in the back office, whose name was Crowley, had spent a long career learning the one thing that made men like him rich, which was that a hard winter and a due note arriving together could take a piece of land off a man for pennies on the dollar, and that the Ashcroft place, with its good water and its long valley and its sound grass, was worth a great deal more than the pennies he intended to pay for it. He closed the ledger. He looked out his window at the gray sky pressing down over the mountains, where the first real cold of the year was already gathering, weeks early, in clouds the color of an old bruise. "Be a hard one this year, I think," Crowley said, to no one. And he smiled, because for him a hard winter was the best news in the world. And he had a long memory for which ranches were just one bad season from belonging to him. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The cold came 3 weeks early, and it came mean. Eliza woke one morning in late October to a sky the color of a bad bruise pressing down on the valley so low she felt she could reach up through the cookhouse window and put her fist into it. The cottonwoods had gone bare overnight, stripped by a wind that came off the mountains with a sound like tearing cloth, and the thermometer nailed to the cookhouse door read 12 degrees at 5 in the morning, which was not October weather. That was January weather. That was the kind of cold that found the gaps in things. The gap between a coat collar and a man's neck. The gap in a barn wall where the chinking had gone soft. The gap between a rancher's due date and his ability to pay. Eliza stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest and looked at the sky and felt in her bones that they were in trouble. The specific, slow-building trouble that doesn't announce itself all at once, but arrives the way a flood does, an inch at a time, until you look down and the water is at your waist and the door is too far away. She went inside and built the fire high and put every pot she had on the range, because cold men are useless men, and useful men start with a hot breakfast. And that was the only thing she could do about the sky right then. By the first week of November, the snow had come and gone twice and come back to stay. The second storm dropped 2 feet in a single night, and the men spent 3 days just getting to the cattle on the North Range, riding through drifts that came to the horses' chests, and 2 of the weaker yearlings were dead in the snow when they got there, frozen where they'd stood, which was $200 Caleb didn't have gone in a night. The creek froze at both banks, and the men had to chop a hole in the ice every morning so the horses could drink, and the wind got under the barn door and couldn't be kept out no matter what they stuffed in the gap. Pete's shoulder, still healing, ached so bad in the cold that he could barely pull on his coat, and Eliza made him a poultice that smelled like something a horse would object to, and it helped some, but some wasn't enough. Caleb stopped sleeping. That was the first sign, and Eliza noticed it before the men did, because she was up at 4 every morning, and he was already in the barn by the time the cookhouse lamp was lit, which meant he'd been up before 4, which meant he hadn't been to bed at all. His face took on a hollowed-out look she recognized, had worn it herself on the road, the look of a person whose mind won't stop running the same numbers and getting the same answer and refusing to believe the answer. She brought him coffee in the barn one morning, 5 o'clock, snow coming sideways out of a black sky, the cattle lowing miserable in the dark from the far pasture, and she found him sitting on a hay bale with the ranch ledger open across his knees and his head in his hands. "How bad?" she said. He looked up. He didn't pretend he didn't know what she was asking. They were past that, past the polite distance of employer and employee, worn through to something rawer. "The note comes due January 15th, he said. "That's the cattle loan, the one I took 2 winters back when I bought the Hendersons' herd. $800. He closed the ledger. The plan was to sell in the fall, after the weight was on them, get top price at the Laramie market, pay off the note with room to spare. The plan assumed a normal fall. And now I've got yearlings dying in the snow, and the ones that are alive have dropped weight because they can't get to the grass under the drifts. And if I sell them the way they are, I'll get maybe half what I figured on, which pays half the note and leaves me 400 short, which might as well be 4,000 because I don't have it. He put the ledger on the hay bale beside him. The bank will foreclose. He stopped. Or what? There's a man called Crowley in Laramie. He buys bad paper from the bank, ranch notes that are going under, and he'll offer me terms. Lower the payment, push out the date, but the terms always cost more than the note itself in the end, and men who take Silas Crowley's terms end up working their own land for him inside 5 years. Every one of them. I've seen it happen to 3 outfits in this valley alone. Caleb looked at her. He was here, actually, 2 weeks back. While you were in the kitchen, rode up, very polite, asked how we were getting on, said he'd heard the winter was coming hard, and he wanted me to know he was there if I needed a friend. He said the word friend the way a man says a word that means the opposite of what it sounds like. I told him I didn't need one. He said I knew where to find him when I changed my mind. He said when, not if. Eliza stood in the barn with the coffee going cold in her own hand and thought about a man with soft white hands and a ledger, and how the world seemed to contain a whole species of such men, patient as spiders, who did nothing but wait for other people's bad winters to arrive. "Can I see the ledger?" she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "The ledger, the ranch accounts. Can I see them?" "Can I—" He looked at her the way a man looks when he's been asked something he didn't expect and doesn't know whether to be offended or just confused. "You're the cook, Eliza." "I know what I am. Can I see the ledger?" He handed it over. She took it and the coffee both and went back to the cookhouse and sat down at the clean table in the lamplight, and she opened it and began to read. She was not, as she'd said, a bookkeeper. She had no formal education past the reading and figuring her mother had insisted on, the boarding house arithmetic that was all adding and subtracting and making columns, tell the truth. But she had spent 2 months in this kitchen watching how a ranch breathed, what it ate, what it drank, what it bled money on, and where it held. And she had her mother's eye for a column of figures the way some people have an ear for music, the ability to feel where it was off before she could say exactly why. She sat with the ledger for 3 hours, long past the breakfast rush, letting Boone handle the dishes because she needed her hands free to trace lines with her finger and her mind free to hold numbers against each other. She filled 3 sheets of paper with her own figures, checking against Caleb's, correcting her arithmetic twice and his once. And slowly, the way a shape emerges from fog when you've been staring long enough, something appeared that she hadn't been looking for and he hadn't seen. The cattle. Not all of them together, that was the mistake. Selling the whole herd at once, late in the season, when the weight was down and the market was glutted with other ranchers doing exactly the same thing for exactly the same desperate reasons. But the ledger showed something else. A page in the summer accounts where Caleb had noted in his cramped handwriting that 15 head of his 3-year-old steers had been appraised by a buyer from Cheyenne at $38 a head. The buyer had wanted the whole lot, and Caleb had turned him down, holding out for a better price that never came because the winter arrived first. $38. 15 head. Eliza did the arithmetic. $570. Not enough alone, but she kept reading, kept adding, kept stacking her columns, and when she was done, she sat back and pressed her fingers to her eyes and thought hard for a long while, because what she was seeing was a way out, but it was a narrow way, and it would require doing something that would probably make Caleb furious and possibly lose her the job, and it went against everything a man like him had been taught about how cattle were sold and by whom and when. She closed the ledger. She got up and put on her coat and walked across the yard in 6 inches of snow to find Caleb. He was at the south fence line with Boone and Dutch, working on a section the wind had knocked flat, and his face when he looked up at her coming across the field said plainly that whatever she had, he was too tired to hear it right. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I'm working." "I know you are. This won't take long and it matters." She glanced at Boone and Dutch, who were both conspicuously not looking at them, which meant they were listening hard. "Alone." Caleb handed his wire stretcher to Dutch without a word, and walked with Eliza 20 paces off along the fence line, out of earshot. The wind cut between them, lifting the hair off her forehead. She'd forgotten her hat. She didn't care. Those 15 steers, she said. The 3-year-olds, the ones the buyer from Cheyenne offered 38 on. What about them? Are they still in good condition, compared to the rest? Caleb thought about it, rubbing his jaw. Better than most. They're older. They've got more to lose before it shows. And I had them on the south pasture where the grass stayed a little longer under the snow. Why? Because they're the best cattle you have right now. And they're only going to get worse the longer they stand in that snow. She held his eyes. You need to sell them this week, before they lose another pound. Get those 15 head to Laramie now, and you'll clear 550, maybe 570, depending what the market does. I worked it out 3 different ways, and the number's the same every time. That's not the whole note, but it's most of it, and there are 3 or 4 other things in those accounts that can cover the gap. She pressed on before he could speak. The blacksmith's bill in Cheyenne that you've been paying in installments, if you settle it all at once, right now, he'll take it at a discount. That's what the note at the bottom of the July page means. That's what full settlement considered means in a bill. There's probably $30 in that, maybe more. And the lease on the north grazing, Eliza. He said it flat, not angry, just stopping her. It's November. You don't sell cattle in November. You sell in September. Everyone knows. Everyone is going broke selling in September, she said. Every rancher in this valley held their cattle for the fall market, and the fall market got buried under 2 feet of snow, and now they're all going to sell the same thin, sorry cattle at the same thin, sorry price in December and January. And that's exactly what Crowley is counting on, Caleb. He's counting on you doing what every other man does. He planned for it. He rode up here and told you he was planning for it. A long silence. The wind moved through the fence wire with a low, keen sound, and the snow shifted in little dry clouds across the hard ground. If I sell those 15 now, Caleb said slowly, I don't have enough beef to fill my spring contracts. You have enough to fill 2 of the 3. Let the Henderson contract go. I read the penalty clause. It's 8% of contract value, which works out to about $40, and losing 40 hurts less than defaulting the whole note. You read the penalty clause. I read everything in that ledger, Caleb. It took me 3 hours, and I'm sorry I didn't ask first, but I needed to see all of it before I said anything, because I didn't want to tell you there was a way out unless I was sure there was one. She stopped, swallowed. I'm not sure. I want to be honest with you. I'm not a banker. I'm a cook who did boarding house arithmetic in a kitchen at 4 in the morning. But I've looked at these numbers 6 different ways, and they keep coming out the same, and my mother could stretch $1 across a week, and she taught me everything she knew. And what I know is that those 15 steers are the most valuable thing on this ranch right now. And every day you leave them in the snow, they're less valuable. And Crowley gets a day closer to owning everything they're standing on. Caleb was very still. She'd learned his stillness by now. It wasn't coldness, wasn't distance. It was the way he went when he was thinking hardest, when he was taking a thing apart inside his head with the same careful hands he'd use on a piece of broken equipment. She stood in the cold and let him think, and didn't push again, because she'd pushed enough, because the rest was his. The Henderson contract, he said finally. That's Jim Henderson's boy. Jim will be sore. Jim's boy will find another buyer. His beef is in better shape than yours. He's got that sheltered canyon. He'll be all right. You know Jim Henderson's pasture situation. Dutch told me. I asked him about every ranch in the valley 2 months ago because I figured I'd need to know it eventually, and I didn't know how or when. She looked at him steadily. Was that wrong of me? Caleb let out a long breath that came out white in the cold air, and he turned and looked out at the south pasture where the 15 3-year-old steers stood in their winter coats in the snow, big and dark and solid looking. Still, better than the rest. She was right about that. He knew she was right about that in his gut. Even while his head was throwing up every objection a man's pride and habit could manufacture. When I came home with you on that horse, he said, I told myself it was because I needed a cook. I want you to know I knew even then I was lying to myself. He didn't look at her. I knew you were something more than that before you said 10 words to me. I just didn't know what. I kept waiting to find out what. Eliza was quiet. The wind pulled at her hair. And now those 15 steers, Caleb said, still not looking at her. You want me to trust you. I want you to trust the numbers. They're your numbers, Caleb. I just read them. Another long silence. Then he put two fingers in his mouth and gave a sharp whistle, the kind that carries, and Boone's head came up from the fence line 40 yards off. "Boone," Caleb called, "get the horses up. You and me and Dutch are going to cut 15 head out of the south pasture, and you're going to ride with me to Laramie first light tomorrow." Boone looked across the snow at him, then at Eliza, then back. "Selling?" he said. "Selling." A pause. "Bit late in the year, boss." "I know it," Caleb said. "Eliza, go inside. You'll freeze." She went. But she stood at the cookhouse window a while, in the warmth, watching him walk back to the fence line, and she knew she'd either just saved this place or blown it apart, and the not knowing was a physical thing sitting on her sternum, and she'd felt it before. The night she'd put Pete's shoulder back, the second before the bone went home, and she knew there was nothing to do with that feeling but let it be there and get on with dinner regardless. She got on with dinner. They left at first light, Caleb and Boone and Dutch with the 15 steers, and the yard felt lopsided without them. Too quiet. The remaining men subdued in a way that said they knew something was happening, but not what. And Eliza fed them and didn't explain, and they didn't ask, and the day went slow. The second day went slower. On the evening of the third day, she was cutting potatoes at the work table when she heard the horses, and she set the knife down and wiped her hands and went to the door. And there they were coming down the valley in the early dark. 3 riders, and she counted 3 and felt the thing on her sternum ease by half. She had coffee on when they came through the door, and she put it in front of them and stood and waited, and Caleb reached into his coat and laid a folded piece of paper on the table and pushed it toward her without a word. She opened it. It was a bank draft, $565 made out to Caleb Ashcroft. She looked up. Price was $37.50, he said. Buyer tried for $36, and I told him Eliza Harrow had worked out what they were worth, and if he wanted to argue with her, he could ride up to the ranch and do it. He picked up his coffee. He paid $37.50. Dutch made a sound that was half laugh and half cough, and turned away to hide his face. Boone said, "I'd like to see the man that'd argue with Mrs. Harrow over $1.50. The draft was enough, plus the blacksmith settlement and 2 other smaller things Eliza had flagged, to meet the January note. But she knew, and Caleb knew, and she suspected Crowley knew before they did, that meeting the note was not the same as being safe, and there were miles yet to go before this winter could be called survived, rather than just weathered so far. It was 2 weeks after the cattle drive that Silas Crowley rode up the Ashcroft Road for the second time. Eliza saw him from the cookhouse window, a neat man on a gray horse, well-dressed for the weather, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who isn't worried about arriving because he's sure of his welcome wherever he goes. He had a soft, round face and a good coat, and the look of a man who'd spent his whole adult life indoors while other people stood in the cold. She'd seen the type before. She'd signed papers in front of the type. She took off her apron. She went out through the kitchen into the main house, which she'd never done uninvited, and found Caleb in the front room looking out the window at the man on the gray horse. "I'll stay," she said, "if you'll have me." Caleb turned. He looked at her, reading something in her face. "He's not coming to negotiate," she said. "He's coming to count the bodies. Men like him don't knock on a door when they think the door is still locked. He knows something, or thinks he does, and he's here to find out if he's right." "You need me to stay." Caleb said, "It's not your fight." "It became my fight the morning I opened that ledger. You want me there or not?" He studied her face for another second. Then he said, "Stay," and turned back to the window. Crowley came in, and he was exactly as Eliza had expected him, which is to say he was warm and reasonable and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He accepted coffee, which she poured and didn't drink herself, and he sat in the good chair by the stove and he talked about the weather, which was bad, and the cattle market, which was worse, and he expressed his genuine personal concern for the hardships facing honest cattlemen in a season like this one. He said the word honest the way a card cheat says it. "I've heard you've had some losses," he said to Caleb, at the point in the conversation where they all knew the real conversation was beginning. "The early snow, terrible thing. I've heard you've had to make some hard choices." "All ranches make hard choices in a hard season," Caleb said. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, hat off, face even. He was better at this than Eliza had expected. "Of course." Crowley's smile turned sympathetic. "And the note, coming due in January. That's a pressure a man could do without, on top of everything else. I want you to know, Caleb. May I call you Caleb? I want you to know that it's not the bank's intention to make this harder than it needs to be. We're neighbors, after all. This valley works because the people in it look out for each other. The note will be paid, Caleb said, in full, by the 15th. Crowley didn't change his expression, but something behind his eyes shifted. A small thing, recalibration. That's wonderful news. That's just what I'd hoped to hear. He looked briefly at Eliza. Though I have to say, I was a bit surprised to hear you'd sold off the Cheyenne grade steers early, in November. That's not the usual approach. It worked out, Caleb said. It did. Yes. Crowley turned his coffee cup on his knee. Though it leaves you a bit light in the spring, doesn't it? The Henderson contract. I believe you've notified Jim's boy you can't fill that order. He let the pause sit there. Word gets around, you know how it is. People worry. Eliza had been quiet till that point, and she'd meant to stay quiet, but she looked at Crowley's soft face and his good coat and thought about a piece of paper a man with hands like his had put in front of a widow in a bank office, and she said, They worry about themselves mostly, Mr. Crowley. Same as you. You came up here in November to look at a ranch you expected to buy for pennies in January, and now you find out you can't, and you're trying to work out what happened. That's what the concern is about. That's what the neighborliness is about. The room went very still. Crowley looked at her. He took her in the way a man takes in something he didn't see coming, fully, carefully, reassessing. I don't believe I've had the pleasure, he said pleasantly. Eliza Harrow. I cook for Mr. Ashcroft, and I read his ledgers, which I expect is the part that's inconveniencing you right now. The smile didn't waver. That was the thing about Crowley. He was a professional, and professionals don't let you see the moment you've landed the punch. But she saw it anyway, in the stillness that was a half-second too long, the precise stillness of a man recalculating. Well, he said, and stood, and buttoned his coat. I can see things are well in hand here. Caleb, I'm glad to hear it. I truly am. He put his hat on. If anything changes, this winter has a long way to go still. You know where to find me. We know, Caleb said. He was 3 steps toward the door when Eliza said, Mr. Crowley? He stopped. She waited until he turned. The Henderson boy will fill his contract from Jim Farley's herd, up the North Fork. Farley's been looking for a buyer and the grades match. They're shaking hands on it this week, I believe. I mention it because I know you had an interest in Farley's note too, and I thought you should know that particular door is also closing. She didn't actually know that. She'd reasoned it out from Dutch's Valley gossip and 2 lines in the summer ledger and the kind of arithmetic her mother had taught her, the arithmetic of people and what they needed and who had what to trade, and she was approximately 90% certain she was right, and certain enough to say it with the other 10% of her face very still and calm. Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went out. They heard his horse on the frozen ground, moving away, unhurried still. Because a man like that didn't hurry, didn't let anyone see that he was anything other than the least concerned person in any room he'd left. The sound faded down the valley road and went quiet. Caleb let out a breath. Was that true? He said. About Farley and Henderson. Mostly, Eliza said. 70%, maybe 80%. Farley's got the stock and Henderson's boy needs to fill the order from somewhere. I just put it together out loud before I'd confirmed it. And if you were wrong, if I was wrong, I bluffed a banker with a ranch cook's arithmetic, and we'd both know it by Thursday. She picked up Crowley's barely touched coffee cup and carried it to the kitchen. I wasn't wrong. Caleb followed her to the kitchen doorway. He stood there watching her rinse the cup, and his face had a look she'd only seen a few times, unguarded, unprepared for what it was feeling. You knew what he was the second you saw him out that window, he said. I've met him before, she said. Not him exactly. A man like him. In a bank office in Cheyenne when Joseph was 3 days dead, and I had a note put in front of me that I'd never signed. She set the cup in the rack. They're all the same. Good coat, soft hands, very reasonable voice, and they're counting something while they talk to you. They're always counting. The only way to beat them is to count faster. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and the potatoes she'd been cutting and the cold coming off Caleb's coat, and for a moment she felt the whole weight of the last months pressing down on her, the road and the ditch, and the berries, and the 9 men and Pete on the table, and the ledger at 4 in the morning, and Crowley's soft face, all of it stacked up on her shoulders. And she was so tired suddenly that her hands gripped the edge of the sink for something solid. Caleb crossed the kitchen. He put both hands on the sink rail beside hers, not touching, just near, bracketing her without crowding her, and said quietly, "I wouldn't have seen it. The cattle, the numbers, any of it. I'd have sat in that barn and worked the same math till January and ended up at Crowley's door. You'd have figured something out." "I don't think I would have. I think I was too far down in it. A man inside his own trouble can't see the shape of it." He was close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off him. "I owe you more than wages, Eliza." She didn't turn around. She looked at her own hands on the sink rail, chapped from the cold and the hot water and the constant work, and she thought about what owing meant and what it cost a proud man to say it. "Don't owe me," she said. "I'm not interested in being owed. Just let me keep counting. Let me keep looking at the books and thinking ahead, the way I've been thinking ahead in this kitchen since the first morning. The food is half of it. The rest of it is, the ranch needs a mind that isn't inside the trouble to look at the trouble. Let me be that." A long silence. "All right," Caleb said. And then the wind hit the house, hard, a gust that rattled the window glass in its frame and sent a cold finger under the door, and outside the snow began again, white and indifferent, covering everything. And inside the cookhouse, the fire burned steady in the range, and Eliza Harrow stood at the sink in a dead woman's boots and thought about January 15th and all the frozen miles between now and then, and told herself that they'd come this far and it would have to be enough. But the winter, as Crowley had said on his way out, had a long way to go. The note was paid on January 12th, 3 days early, which was Eliza's doing, because she'd looked at the calendar and looked at the weather and decided that a man like Crowley would find a way to make a 15th of the month deadline feel like the 17th if the roads were bad enough, and the messenger was his, and she wasn't going to give him the gap. She'd told Caleb this on a Tuesday, and he'd ridden to Laramie on Wednesday, Boone beside him, the bank draft in his inside coat pocket against his chest where he could feel it, and he'd put it on the desk of the bank manager, not Crowley. Crowley worked in the back, behind a closed door, and Caleb made sure the transaction happened in front of witnesses, in the front room, with a receipt written and signed before he moved from the chair. He came home in the dark, frozen to the saddle, and Eliza had kept supper warm the way she always did when someone was late, a plate at the back of the range with a pot lid over it, and she put it in front of him without ceremony and stood with her arms folded and waited. And he pulled the receipt from his coat and laid it on the table, and she picked it up and read it and set it back down. "Good," she said. That was all. But that night, after the kitchen was clean and the men were in the bunkhouse and the receipt was folded in the ranch lockbox where it would stay until the paper yellowed, Eliza sat down at the long table alone and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel the full size of what had almost happened. The ranch almost gone. Caleb broken and sold out by February. The men scattered to other outfits or the road. The valley one more piece of Crowley's quiet empire. It had been that close. A month, maybe less. She'd come into this kitchen with nothing but a borrowed pair of dead woman's boots and the arithmetic her mother taught her, and she'd found the crack in the wall just wide enough to get her fingers into, and she'd pulled, and it had held. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the way she'd felt after Pete's shoulder went back, the shaking that comes after, when the danger is past, and the body finally gets permission to be afraid of what it just did. She sat at the table and shook a little, and then stopped and got up and went to bed, because the cattle still needed feeding in the morning, and the men would be at the table at 5 o'clock, and the ranch did not pause for a person to collect herself. What she hadn't expected was what the pain of the note did to the men. She'd thought relief would feel like lightness, like a weight lifted, and maybe for Caleb it did, in private, in whatever room of himself he kept private. But for the men it seemed to come out differently. They got louder. Not mean loud, not trouble loud, but the specific loud of men who've been holding their breath without knowing it, and have now exhaled all at once. Every one of them, and the bunkhouse on the night Caleb came home with the receipt, became something Eliza could hear from the cookhouse, laughter and the fiddle and a kind of rowdy, grateful noise that went on until well past midnight when she'd normally have gone over and knocked on the wall. She didn't knock. She sat in her room with her lamp low and listened to it and thought that the sound of men who aren't afraid anymore was one of the better sounds the world contained. But the winter didn't care about bank receipts, and it wasn't done. January gave way to February, and February was merciless, a month of storms that came one behind the other without enough clear days between them to fully dig out from the last. A section of the barn roof gave under the weight of accumulated snow, not a catastrophic collapse, but a bad sag in the middle span that let a wedge of cold in over 6 stalls and cost them 3 days of work to brace and patch. And the patching was imperfect because you can't do good carpentry work with hands that won't stay warm. 2 more yearlings died, which hurt, though nothing like losing them would have hurt before January 12th. The road south went impassable for 11 days, and they ran low on salt and completely out of coffee, which was the thing that came closest to breaking morale. The salt they could manage without for cooking purposes because Eliza knew what to do about that, but the coffee was a genuine deprivation, a daily small misery, and she watched the men's faces at breakfast every morning going just a degree flatter without it. On the 8th day of no coffee, Dutch came to breakfast with a jar of something brown and presented it with enormous ceremony. "What is that?" Boone said. "Chicory," Dutch said. "From my wife's stores. I've been saving it." He set it in the middle of the table like an offering. "It ain't coffee, I'll tell you that straight. But it's hot and it's dark, and if you squint, it's almost the right smell." There was a silence. Then Pete, whose shoulder was almost right now, reached out and took the jar and smelled it and passed it on without comment. And each man smelled it and passed it. And when it came back around to Dutch, he looked at Eliza, who had watched all of this from the stove. "You knew he had that," Boone said to her. "I did not." "Then how come you don't look surprised?" "Because after 4 months I don't expect to be surprised by this outfit anymore," Eliza said. She took the jar from Dutch. "Sit down, all of you. I'll make it properly, or it won't be any good at all." She made it properly. It wasn't coffee, but it was hot and bitter, and it had the basic dignity of a warm drink on a cold morning, and the men drank it without complaint, and Dutch sat at the end of the table looking like a man who'd brought his people through the desert on the strength of a single jar of chicory, which, in a small way, he had. Eliza noticed things like that. She'd always noticed things. It was the skill her mother had tried to put a name to and never quite could. Not kindness exactly, not generosity, but the specific attention to what people needed that ran ahead of the asking. She noticed that Pete's confidence in his own arm had not come fully back since the fall, that he favored it still even when it didn't need favoring, and so she put the heaviest pots on shelves he had to reach for, and didn't say anything, and watched him use the arm without thinking and gain the confidence back without knowing he was doing it. She noticed that Boone went quiet and difficult on the anniversary of something, she didn't know what, in early February, and she made his favorite meal that day without being asked and didn't draw attention to it. Just put the plate down, and Boone looked at it, and then at her. And something moved in his face, something raw, and he said very quietly, "How'd you know?" And she said, "You get a look. Eat your supper." And he did, and the quiet, difficult day passed without incident. She noticed Caleb most of all, which was a different kind of noticing. One she was less comfortable with because she couldn't file it away under cooking, or practicality, or the general management of the people in her care. She noticed the way he carried his grief, which was different from how most men carried it. Not buried, not performed, but worn the way a man wears a coat he's had so long, he's stopped feeling the weight of it, and only knows it's there when someone points it out. She noticed that he talked about Sarah sometimes, and didn't seem to need her to respond. Just needed to say the name aloud to someone who wouldn't flinch from it. And she gave him that, sitting at the table in the last quarter hour of the evening, giving him the room to say what he needed to say without making it mean something she didn't have the right to make it mean. She noticed that he'd started telling her things before he told the men. Not because she'd asked to be consulted. She hadn't, not officially. The conversation in the kitchen, after Crowley left, had stayed carefully general, "Let me keep counting, let me be that." But because somewhere between the ledger and the cattle sale and the day she'd faced down a banker on his behalf in his own front room, he'd developed the habit of talking through his decisions with her first, and she'd developed the habit of telling him what she thought. And neither of them had named this arrangement because naming it would have required looking directly at what it was, and they'd agreed, without words, not to do that yet. It was Dutch who finally said it out loud, because Dutch had said the true things in this outfit since before any of them arrived, and he seemed to feel that was his function and intended to keep performing it. He came to the cookhouse on a Tuesday morning when the other men were out checking the herd, too cold for conversation but not cold enough to stay in, and he sat down at the table and accepted his coffee and said, without preamble, "You know the men have been talking." Eliza was rolling pie crust. She didn't stop. "Men always talk. What about you and Caleb?" She rolled for another few seconds, keeping her hands even. "There's nothing to talk about." "Mrs. Harrow." Dutch wrapped both hands around his cup. "I've worked for this man 7 years. I watched him after Sarah. I know what he looks like when he's just managing, and I know what he looks like when he's living, and since October he's been living, and every man on this place knows why, and none of them begrudge it. I want you to know that. They think the world of you, and they think the world of him, and it's a plain fact that you've come to be something to each other that's more than you've let either of you call it." Eliza set down the rolling pin. She looked at the pie crust, not at Dutch. Outside the window, the snow lay heavy and still over the valley, and the sky was pale and low, and the mountains had disappeared into it. "He hasn't said anything," she said. "Well, no," Dutch agreed. "He won't. He's the stubbornest man in Wyoming, and he thinks there are about 6 reasons he shouldn't, beginning with the fact that you work for him, and ending with the fact that he buried a woman, and he's not sure he's allowed to want anything after that." Dutch finished his coffee. "I'm not saying any of this to push you. I'm just saying, us men, we see it, and you should know you have us all behind you, whatever it comes to or doesn't. That's all." He got up, put his cup in the rack the way all the men had learned to do, and went back out into the cold. Eliza stood at the work table for a moment with flour on her hands and Dutch's words sitting on the table where he'd left them. Then she picked up the rolling pin and finished the pie crust, because a pie half made was a thing that couldn't wait. And she thought about aloud, and what it meant, and who got to decide, and whether she had the right to decide it any more than Caleb did. The truth was she'd been not looking at the same thing he had. She'd told herself she was practical. She was always practical. She'd built her whole survival on being practical, on the arithmetic of needs and means, and what a situation required. She'd told herself she was grateful and careful, and a woman in a borrowed position who couldn't afford to be a fool about a man who'd done her a kindness. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she'd handed him hot coffee in a cold barn and meant more by it than coffee, and she'd held her ground in his front room against a man who wanted to take everything from him because the thought of Crowley winning was something she couldn't stand to look at, and not entirely for the ranch's sake. And she'd known for some time that she was going to have to deal with this and had been putting it off the way you put off a conversation that will change something. "You're not sure you're ready to have changed." She put the pie in the oven. She adjusted the damper. She thought about the woman who'd been eating berries in a ditch in September. The one who'd been so sure there was nothing left that she'd been ready to let herself go quietly among the sagebrush with the hawk crying overhead. That woman was the same woman standing at this range right now, and was also not the same woman at all. And the distance between them was made of biscuits at 5 a.m, and a boy's shoulder gone back into its socket, and a ledger read by lamplight, and a banker's smile that hadn't landed because she'd counted faster than he had. She was still afraid. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. Trust was the thing the road had taken from her along with everything else, and getting it back was not a simple thing, not the way getting back a coat or a piece of furniture was simple. You didn't find it somewhere. You had to build it, nail by nail, the way you'd build a fence in ground you'd never broken, and you had to be willing to do it wrong the first time and pull it up and start again. She'd been building it here, in this kitchen, with these men, and this man, all winter. And she didn't know yet how strong it was, or where it would hold and where it wouldn't. But she was still here. That was the thing. Every morning she'd had the choice, and every morning she'd stayed, not out of desperation now, not because there was nowhere else, but because there was nowhere she wanted more to be. And that was new. That was a thing she hadn't felt since before Joseph got sick, and it scared her some, and she let it scare her, because it meant something worth being scared about. The pie came out imperfect, the crust a little dark on the left side because she'd been thinking instead of watching the oven, and she put it on the rack and looked at it and decided the men wouldn't care, which they wouldn't. The afternoon came on slow and cold and gray, and by 4 o'clock the light was already going out of the sky, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. and Eliza was starting supper when she heard the main house door, and then steps on the porch, and then Caleb came into the cookhouse the way he did in the evenings, but earlier than usual, his coat still on, bringing the cold in with him. He stood just inside the door. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself see, a kind of braced look, the look of a man who's decided to do a thing before he changes his mind. "I talked to Dutch this morning," he said. Eliza kept stirring. "Did you?" "He told me he'd talk to you." "He did." A silence. The range muttered. Outside, wind moved through the eave and made a thin whistling sound. "I owe you a conversation," Caleb said. "A real one, not the last quarter-hour kind, a real one, about what's—" He stopped, started again. "About what this has been. What I think it is. For me." He took his hat off. "I'm not good at this. I want to tell you that first so you have low expectations and I have some chance of meeting them." Eliza stopped stirring. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, hat in both hands, big and awkward and entirely without the shell he usually wore. And she thought that this was what he looked like when he wasn't protecting himself from anything, and that she hadn't seen it before, or he hadn't shown it before, and that it cost him something to be standing here without it. She could see exactly what it cost him, and the sight of that cost did something to her sternum that was the opposite of the weight she'd been carrying for months. "Caleb," she said. "Let me get it out," he said, "or I'll lose the nerve and we'll be back to last quarter hour for another 3 months. And I can't." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I can't keep sitting at that table in the evenings talking about the fence line and the price of feed when what I want to say is something entirely different. And I'm a plain man and I don't say things pretty, but I want to say it, if you'll hear it." Eliza folded her hands in front of her apron. She waited. He looked at her, straight at her, the way he'd looked at her in the ditch on the Laramie Road, flat and honest, and wanting nothing except the truth of what was there. "I don't know exactly when it happened," he said. "I know it wasn't one moment. I know it was the damper on the range the first night, and the way you talked to Boone, and the morning with Pete, and you standing in my front room telling Crowley to his face that you'd counted faster than him." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I know it was every morning at 5 o'clock, and every night at the table, and every time I came back from something hard, and you had something hot waiting, and didn't make me talk about it till I was ready. I know I was a man working himself to death on a sinking ranch. And I know I'm not that anymore. And I know the reason is you. And I don't want to be the employer who makes life uncomfortable for the woman who works for him. That's the last thing I want. And if I've read this wrong, you can tell me flat and I'll take it, and we'll go back to how it was." "You haven't read it wrong," Eliza said. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm scared of it," she said, because she'd promised herself she'd be honest. "I want you to know that. I've had one marriage, and it ended with me digging a grave in frozen ground and walking a road to nowhere and eating berries in a ditch, and I don't—" She stopped, tried again. "Trust is not a thing I have to spare right now. What I've been doing here, it's cost me something to do it, to stay, to let myself settle in and start to care about this place and these men and—" She looked at him. "And you. It's cost me something every day, and I've paid it because I thought it was worth it, and I still think it's worth it, but I need you to know it isn't easy for me, and it probably won't be, not for a while. I need you to know that before anything else." Caleb was very still, in the way of his stillness, that deep, patient quiet. "I know it," he said. "And I'm not what I was," she said. "I'm not the woman I was before the road. I'm harder than I was and more suspicious, and I'll argue with you, and I'll look at your ledger without asking, and I'll tell you when you're wrong. And I know that too. And I haven't decided—" She stopped. "I'm not saying yes to anything tonight. I'm saying I haven't read it wrong either, and I think you should know that. And we should—" She gestured vaguely at the range, the kitchen, the window where the snow pressed close and white against the glass. "We should let it be what it is and see where it goes without either of us running from it." Caleb stood there with his hat in his hands in the lamplight and looked at the woman who'd saved his ranch and fed his men and argued down his banker and still wouldn't give him more than the truth, no comfort, no promise, just the truth. And something in his face settled, finally, into something that wasn't grief and wasn't fear, and was taking up the space where those things had been for 4 years. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than I had this morning." "It is," she agreed. She turned back to the range. Now hang up your coat and stay for supper, not as my employer. Just stay. He hung up his coat. He sat down at the long table, and the fire burned even in the range, and outside the snow lay deep and still over the valley, over the fence lines and the south pasture and the corrals and the barn with its patched roof, over everything they'd fought to keep. And it was very cold, and in the cookhouse it was warm. February broke slowly, the way bad things do. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in small daily increments that you only recognize looking back. The storms came a little farther apart. The temperature lifted 2 degrees, then dropped 5, then lifted 4 and held there for 3 days running, which was enough for the creek ice to groan and shift at the banks without quite letting go. The light changed first. That was what Eliza noticed before anything else, standing in the cookhouse door one morning at the end of the month. The light came a little earlier and sat a little longer and had a quality to it, a thin, pale warmth that January's light had entirely lacked. She stood in the door with her coffee and felt it on her face and thought that she had survived this winter, which was not something she'd have bet on in September, and that the surviving had taken a shape she couldn't have predicted from that ditch on the Laramie Road. Things between her and Caleb had shifted in the small, careful way of 2 people who've said the true things and are now living alongside them without quite knowing yet what to build. He still came to the cookhouse in the evenings. The conversation was different. Not the careful arm's-length talk of employer and hired cook, but not transformed either. Not suddenly easy, because nothing between 2 people who've both been badly hurt becomes suddenly easy. It was more like, she thought about how to name it sometimes, in the quiet after the men went to the bunkhouse. It was more like they'd opened a door they'd both been pretending wasn't there, and now they stood in the doorframe, neither fully in nor fully out, looking at what was on the other side and deciding, slowly, whether they were going to cross. He'd brought her something from Laramie in late February. He hadn't made a thing of it, just set it on the work table one morning and said he'd seen it and thought she could use it. And it was a good knife, a proper cook's knife with a weighted handle, better than anything she'd been working with, and she'd picked it up and felt the balance of it and not said anything for a moment. And when she looked up, he was already halfway out the door, which was how he handled the things that meant something, by putting them down and leaving before they could be made into more than he knew how to talk about. She'd hung it on the hook above the work table where she could reach it easily, and the men had noticed it there, one by one, the way they noticed everything in the cookhouse that changed, and nobody said a word about it, which was its own kind of saying something. March came in with one last hard storm, a 2-day blizzard that was the winter's final argument, loud and furious and ultimately unconvincing. And when it blew itself out, the sky that came after was so blue it looked like something a person had made up. The snow on the valley floor was deep and still, but the quality of it had changed. It had a crust on top from the melt and freeze of the last weeks, and when the sun hit it in the morning, it threw light in all directions at once, blinding and clean. And Eliza stood in the yard in it and put her hand up to shade her eyes, and felt for the first time in months something that wasn't careful, something uncautious and involuntary, the plain animal relief of a creature that has made it through. The cattle had fared better than feared. They'd lost 11 head all told, which was hard, which Caleb recorded in the ledger with a tight jaw and didn't discuss, but it was survivable. Better than half the valley had done. Word came back through the peddlers and passing hands. The Reardon place up the North Fork had lost 40, nearly a third of their herd, and old man Reardon had taken to his bed and not gotten out, his wife said, for a week. The Halverson homestead down south had simply been abandoned, family gone to Cheyenne when the second storm took their barn, and the word was they wouldn't be back. Eliza heard these reports across the cookhouse table the way you hear accounts of other ships in a storm, with the guilty gratitude of someone still afloat. She knew their survival hadn't been luck, or not only luck, she'd done things, real things, counted numbers and made decisions and stood in a man's front room and told a predatory banker that his plan had failed and those things had mattered. But she also knew that the margin had been thin. 2 or 3 bad breaks going differently, and they'd have been the abandoned homestead, the family in the wagon heading south. You hold that knowledge in one hand and the relief in the other, and you walk carefully, because the ground is still uncertain, and the people who forget that are the ones who fall. It was Pete who first said the word spring out loud on a Thursday morning in the second week of March, looking out the cookhouse window at the blue sky with the expression of a man who'd been a long time underground and was just now permitted to remember what sunlight was for. "Think that's it," he said. "Think she's breaking." "Don't say it," Boone said without looking up from his plate. "You say it and it comes back worse." "It ain't coming back. Look at that sky." I have looked at that sky. I looked at a sky just like it on the 14th of February, and 3 days later we had 2 feet of snow, and I spent a night in the barn with my arm around a heifer so she didn't freeze to death, which is not an experience I look back on fondly. "You named that heifer," Dutch said. "I did not." "You called her Matilda." "I called her something I don't recall what—" "Matilda," Pete said solemnly. He called her Matilda, and he sang to her. I was keeping her calm, with singing. The cookhouse came apart, and Boone's face went red in a way that was not entirely unhappy, the red of a man among people who know his stories and will tell them forever, which is its own particular warmth. And Eliza stood at the range and let the noise wash over her and thought that this specific thing, this battered, cheerful irreverence at a scratched-up table in a kitchen that had been a wreck when she arrived, this was what she'd built, or helped to build, and it was not a small thing, even if it looked like men arguing about a heifer's name. The spring work started before the snow was fully gone, because that was how it always went. The list of what needed doing too long to wait for perfect conditions. Fences to repair, miles of them, winter damaged, posts heaved by the freeze and thaw. The barn roof's patch to be made permanent. The south pasture's drainage ditch to be cleared before the melt turned it into a bog. The cattle to be assessed, tallied, the breeding pairs decided on. The books. And it was the books that brought Eliza and Caleb to a conversation they'd been circling for weeks, the one that changed the shape of what came next. She'd been working through the spring accounts on an April morning, the cookhouse empty, the men out on the fence line, and Caleb had come in early, which he rarely did in daylight. He stood at the table and looked at her work spread across it, her figures, her notes in the margins, the plan she'd been sketching for the next 6 months that went considerably beyond what a cook's wages were supposed to include. "You've been doing this since January," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man stating something he'd known and not addressed. "Since November, really," she said. "The ledger in the barn." I never stopped. He sat down across from her. He looked at the papers. She watched him read, following her columns, her projections, the breeding plan that would bring the herd back in 2 years, the proposal to let the southeast corner of the land to a neighboring family for grazing fees that would offset the lost Henderson contract, the note she'd made about the kitchen garden and how, if they expanded it, they could cut the supply costs by 1/3 through summer and fall. "This is a ranch manager's work," he said. "I know what it is. I'm paying you cooks' wages." "I know that too." He looked up from the papers. He had the look on his face again, the unshelled look, the one that cost him something. "That's not right. That's not a fair arrangement, and I've let it go on because—" He stopped. "Because addressing it meant addressing other things, and I've been slow." "You have," she agreed. She kept her voice even. "But so have I. I could have asked for more money at any point, and I didn't. And the reason wasn't that I didn't know I'd earned it. The reason was that asking would have required a conversation about what this actually is, and I wasn't sure I was ready." "Are you ready now?" She looked at him across her own scattered papers, her months of work spread between them. She thought about the ditch in September and the dead woman's boots, and the first 5 o'clock breakfast, and Pete on the table and the bank draft, and the receipt in the lockbox, and the knife on the hook above the work table, and the way he'd put it down and left before she could say thank you. "I've been ready since February," she said. "I was waiting for you." Caleb spread his hands flat on the table. "Then here's what I'm saying, not as your employer." He held her eyes. "As a man who'd like you to stay, not as the cook, not as the ledger keeper, as—" He stopped, jaw tight, working for the words that didn't come easy to him and never would. "As the person around whom I'd like to build whatever comes next, for the ranch and for—" a breath. "For me." The cookhouse was quiet. Outside, a meadowlark tried one tentative note, the first she'd heard since October, and the sound of it was so unexpected in the lingering cold that it seemed almost unlikely, a thing from another world delivered into this one. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about everything she'd told him in February, that she was afraid, that trust was not a thing she had to spare, that she needed to let it be what it was and see where it went. She'd meant all of it, and it was still true. She was still afraid. She was probably always going to be somewhat afraid. The road saw to that. The road had renovated her in ways that wouldn't be entirely undone, and she'd made a kind of peace with that. The permanent low-grade wariness that came from having lost everything once and knowing it was possible. But she was here. She'd been choosing here every morning for 6 months, and she knew the difference now between staying because there was nowhere else and staying because you wanted to, and she knew which one this was. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face shifted. Relief, she thought, though he'd never call it that. "Tell me," he said. "The books stay with me. I keep the accounts, I have full access, and you don't make a major financial decision without talking to me first. Not because you aren't capable." She said that part firmly. "Because 2 heads are better than 1, and you've seen the evidence of that, and I won't go back to being the woman in the kitchen who isn't allowed to know what's happening with the money." "Done," he said. No hesitation. "The kitchen garden gets expanded this spring. I want it doubled, and I want Pete assigned to help me 1 morning a week because he needs the lighter work for the shoulder anyway, and he's a better gardener than he knows." "Done. And—" She stopped. This was the harder one. "I'm not going to be rushed into anything. Whatever this is, we let it find its own pace, and you don't push and I don't push, and we don't make it into something it isn't yet just because we're both tired of being alone. If it becomes something, it becomes it honestly, or not at all." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Eliza," he said, "I buried my wife. I've had 4 years of alone. I'm not in any hurry. I just—" He looked at the papers between them, her work, her months of quiet, determined effort. "I just wanted it named. I wanted us to know what we were doing here instead of pretending it was something smaller." She understood that. She'd wanted it named too. There was a particular exhaustion to the unnaming of things you both knew were there, and it was good, she thought, to be done with it. "All right," she said. "Then it's named." They sat with that a moment. Then Caleb picked up the top sheet of her projections, the breeding plan, and said, "Walk me through this. The Southeast lease especially. I don't know the Garrison family well enough to know if they're good for it." "I do," Eliza said. "Della Garrison came to me in January about her youngest fever. She's a steady woman, and her husband works hard, and they've been looking for summer grazing for 3 years. They're good for it." She leaned over and pointed at the column. "Here's what I think we can ask." And they worked through the morning like that. The 2 of them at the long table with the cookhouse empty around them and the pale spring light coming through the window, arguing about numbers in the comfortable way of people who trust each other's arithmetic. And the meadowlark outside tried its note again, and this time held it longer, finding the courage for a full measure. The spring came on. And with it came a change in the ranch that was harder to put in the ledger than cattle prices or grazing fees, but was just as real. The men could feel it. Something settled. Something that had been provisional about the place now firmed up, the way a building firms when the last essential beam goes in. They didn't talk about it directly, because working men rarely talked about the things that mattered most, but it showed in small ways. In the care they took with the new fence line, straighter and better set than it needed to be. In the way they started bringing small things back from town without being asked, a bag of good coffee, a bolt of cloth. Someone's wife said would make good curtains, things that were gestures toward permanence, toward the belief that this place was going to last and was worth adding to. Pete had grown up. That was the plainest way to say it. The boy with the cowlick who'd taken his boots off outside the cookhouse door that first morning had become, over one winter, someone you'd trust with the hard call, the kind of man who could be sent somewhere alone and do the right thing without supervision. His shoulder had come fully right by March, and he used it without thinking now, and his confidence had come back with it, and then exceeded it, the way a mended thing sometimes exceeds its original strength at the break. He came to Eliza one afternoon in April and stood in the cookhouse door with his hat in his hands, a gesture she recognized, and she waited. "I wanted to say something," he said, "that I didn't say right after, when you fixed the shoulder." "You said plenty. I said it hurt and then I cried, which is what I said, and it's not. I wanted to say the other thing." He turned the hat. "I was scared, before you did it. Not of the pain, I mean the pain too, but I was scared you weren't going to be able to do it, and I was going to lose the arm, and I knew you were scared too, I could see it, and you did it anyway. And I think about that sometimes when something's hard. He shrugged one shoulder, the repaired one, as if to illustrate. Anyway, I wanted to say it counted for something, more than the shoulder. Eliza looked at him. He was 22 years old, and he'd spent a winter getting knocked around by weather and hard work and one catastrophic fall. And he'd come out the other side of it saying something true to a person he respected, which not every man managed at twice his age. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "That counts for something, too." He put his hat on and went back out, and she turned back to the range, and the thing she felt was not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it, the satisfaction of a person who has put something into the world and watched it take root and grow past what they planted. The valley opened up through April and into May. The grass came back in the south pasture, tentative at first and then with conviction, the particular green of Wyoming spring that was almost aggressive in its greenness after the months of white and brown. The kitchen garden came up, doubled, as agreed, with Pete on his knees beside her one morning a week, learning to thin seedlings with a patience that surprised them both. He had a good hand for it, careful, and Eliza taught him what her mother had taught her, and thought about the strange lines along which knowledge travels. Ohio to Wyoming by way of a boarding house and a frontier road and a cook's kitchen. Caleb watched the grass come in and did his counting, the real counting, the kind you did when you could see clearly in both directions, behind and ahead. The herd was thinner, but sound. The debt was paid. The lease agreement with the garrisons had been signed, and the income from it had already covered 2 months of supply costs. The men were all still there. Not one had quit through the worst of the winter, which was not a thing that happened on most ranches in a year like this, and Caleb knew exactly why it hadn't happened here. He said so directly one evening in the cookhouse, just the two of them, the last quarter hour that was not quite the same thing it used to be. "I did the numbers on winter turnover," he said. "Valley-wide, from what I can gather from the men coming through. Most outfits lost 2, 3 hands to the cold and the hardship. Some lost more. We lost none." Eliza was mending a shirt, Boone's, the left elbow, 3rd time this winter. "I know. That's worth a great deal of money when you think about what it costs to find and break in new hands in the spring." "I know that too. I'm not talking about the money," he said. She looked up from the shirt. "I'm saying, whatever you built here this winter." He looked at the room around him, the clean floor, the gleaming range, the knife on its hook, the rows of the jars she'd put up in the fall, and the new ones she was already planning. "It was more than cooking. I knew that by November. He stopped. "I want the men to know you know it. He tried again. "I'm going to change the arrangement. Officially. I'm going to write it in the ledger that you're the ranch manager. What you've been doing since November, it gets a name, and it gets wages that match it, and it gets written down so it exists in a way that a person can point to." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about the bank office in Cheyenne, the man with soft hands explaining that a paper said something she'd never agreed to. She thought about what it meant to have a thing written down, the way it could be used against you, and the way it could also, in the right hands, be used for you, and how the difference was entirely in whose hands held the pen. "All right," she said, "you're not going to argue with me about it." "I'm going to argue with you about the number," she said. "When you tell me what you're thinking, I'll tell you if it's right." He told her the number. She told him it was short by $15 a month, and explained precisely why. And after 4 minutes of back and forth that involved her citing 3 specific examples from the spring accounts, and him making one counterargument that she conceded was valid and adjusting by 5, they arrived at a figure, and he wrote it in the ledger that night, and she watched him write it. Ranch Manager, E. Harrow. She looked at the words in his cramped handwriting and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she had to identify it slowly, the way you identify a sound you haven't heard in years and know immediately once you name it. It was the feeling of a thing she'd earned being called what it was, in plain language, in a ledger that couldn't be argued with or taken away or rewritten by a soft-handed man in a back office. It was not the same as before. The homestead, the life with Joseph, the thing she'd had and lost. She didn't want it to be. That life was gone and she'd done her grieving for it, out on the road, alone, in ways that had cost her everything she'd had left, and she'd come out the other side of that grief changed in ways that were not going to change back. She was not the woman she'd been at 19 when she married, Or the woman she'd been at 33 when she stood in front of a banker and didn't understand the paper he put in front of her. She was someone the road had made, a person built out of necessity and loss, and the stubborn refusal, in the end, to let either of those things be the last word. And that person had a kitchen and a ledger and a knife with a good balance, and 9 men who took their boots off at the door, and a man who put things down and left before they could be made into more than he could say, and a meadowlark that had found its full voice now and sang it every morning over the valley without apology. Summer came to the Medicine Bow foothills the way it always does, suddenly and completely, as if winter had been a conversation it was done having. The ranch settled into its warm weather rhythm. The long days, the cattle on the high grass, the evening light that lasted till 9 o'clock and made everything look the way things look in a memory of better times. The men worked hard and came to the table hungry and went to bed tired and got up and did it again. And the cookhouse was the center of it, had been the center of it since the first 5 o'clock breakfast in September, would be the center of it as long as Eliza Harrow stood at that range and watched the damper and thought ahead. On a July evening, with the last of the light going gold on the mountains and the smell of the garden coming in through the open cookhouse door. Tomatoes, she'd planted tomatoes this year. A risk at this altitude, a risk that was paying off. Caleb came to the doorway and stood there the way he'd stood on the first night, hat in hand, looking at her in a way he no longer tried to hide. "Walk with me," he said. She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook beside the good knife. She walked out into the long summer evening at the side of a man she had not expected in September to still be beside in July, and they went down to the creek, which was running clear and fast now with the snowmelt long since done, and they stood on the bank in the last of the light and didn't say anything for a while because there are kinds of silence between people that are not absence but presence. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that don't need saying because they are simply true, and both people know it. "I was thinking," Caleb said, finally, "about what a man asks when he means more than he knows how to say." Eliza looked at the water. "I've been thinking about it a while," he said. "I want to get it right. I'm not going to get it right, but I want to." "Then don't try to get it right," she said. "Just say the true thing." He was quiet another moment. The creek went over its rocks with a sound like a conversation at low volume. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the manager, not as the cook. I'd like you to stay as—" he turned his hat once. "As mine, if that's a word you'd use back." Eliza stood on the creek bank in the summer evening and thought about the word, what it carried, the weight of it, and the warmth of it. She thought about what she'd said in February, not rushed, not pushed, honestly or not at all. And she thought about the months that had passed since then, the daily accumulation of small truths between them that had become, without ceremony, something she counted on. She thought about the ditch. She'd thought about the ditch many times since September. Return to it the way you return to a bad dream that also contains somewhere in it the seed of something that later proved necessary. The woman in that ditch had been entirely sure she was finished, had been, in the strange, cold logic of exhaustion and grief, almost at peace with it. And then a man on a horse had knocked the berries out of her hand and asked her a question that turned out to be the wrong question for what he needed, and the right question for what she needed, and neither of them had known the difference until much later. What she'd found in the months since was not rescue. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She'd rescued herself one 5 o'clock morning at a time, one column of figures, one decision, one hard conversation. What Caleb had given her was not rescue, but a place to stand while she did it. A kitchen, a stove, a clean floor, and a man who recognized early on and without much fuss that the woman he'd found in a ditch was considerably more than what the ditch had made her look like. That was not a small thing. That might be, in the end, the most important thing. She turned to look at him. He was watching the water, giving her the room she always needed, and she thought that he would always do that, always give her the room. Because it was his nature, and also because he'd learned her, the way you learn someone over months of honest proximity, and knowing a person's nature and learning their particular self were two different gifts, and he'd given her both. "Yes," she said. He turned. "Yes," she said again, to be sure it landed. "That's a word I'd use back." He looked at her with the unshelled face, the one that cost him, and she looked back without flinching, and neither of them said anything further about it because the thing had been said, and it was enough. They stood by the creek a while longer until the light was nearly gone and the first stars came out over the mountains, and then they walked back up to the ranch together, to the lit window of the cookhouse, and the good smell of the tomatoes still coming in on the evening air, and the sound of the fiddle starting up in the bunkhouse. Somebody's Saturday night habit that had never stopped, and the whole of Ashcroft Ranch quiet and imperfect and alive around them in the summer dark. Eliza Harrow, who had arrived with nothing and eaten poison to leave and stayed instead to build something she hadn't known she was building, walked through the cookhouse door and tied her apron back on and checked the damper on the range out of pure habit. It was set right. It was always set right now. She looked at the kitchen, her kitchen, the clean iron of the range and the knife on its hook and the jars of the summer's putting up and the long table where 9 men sat in their socks and argued about heifers' names, and she felt, simply and without complication, at home. Not the home she'd lost. That was gone, and she'd stopped pretending it wasn't. This was a different thing, a thing built out of what the road left after it took everything else. And it was harder-edged and less innocent than what she'd had before. And it was hers in a way that nothing signed in a bank office ever could be. Because she hadn't been given it. She'd earned it, one morning at a time, with her own 2 hands.